My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 38 years old, and for 32 years I believed my father, Pastor David Mitchell, had abandoned our family. Until I found his wedding ring in an abandoned car deep in Millbrook Forest, and everything I thought I knew about my life crumbled to pieces. It started 3 weeks ago when I received a call from Jenkins and Associates, a law firm I'd never heard of. The voice on the other end was professional but hesitant. "Miss Mitchell? This is regarding your father's estate. We need to discuss some developments." I almost hung up. Dad had been gone since 1991 when I was 6. Mom remarried, we moved away from Millbrook, and I'd spent decades trying to forget the man who chose his congregation over his family. But something in the lawyer's tone made me listen. "We've been managing a trust fund your father established before his disappearance. The conditions were very specific. It could only be accessed if certain evidence came to light. Miss Mitchell, we believe that time has come." The meeting was set for the following Friday in Millbrook, a town I hadn't seen in over 30 years. As I drove down the familiar country roads, memories flooded back. The white steeple of Grace Community Church piercing the sky. The parsonage where we lived. The congregation that worshipped my father like he was a saint. At the law office, Mr. Jenkins, a man in his 70s with kind eyes, slid a thick folder across his mahogany desk. "Your father came to see me in October 1991, just 2 weeks before he vanished. He was troubled. Said he'd discovered something that would destroy people he loved, but staying silent would destroy his soul." He opened the folder, revealing documents I couldn't immediately understand. Bank statements, photographs, handwritten notes in my father's careful script. He set up this trust with very specific instructions. If he disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and if evidence of foul play ever surfaced, this information was to be given to you on your 35th birthday or later. My hands trembled as I picked up a photograph. It showed a black sedan hidden under a canvas tarp, deep in what looked like Millbrook Forest. 3 days ago, a logging company found this car. It's been there for over 30 years. Inside, Mr. Jenkins paused, his voice heavy. Inside, they found personal effects belonging to your father. The police have reopened his case as a potential homicide. The room spun around me. "You're saying my father didn't abandon us?" "Miss Mitchell, I believe your father died trying to protect you and your mother from something he'd uncovered. These documents suggest he stumbled upon a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Millbrook's religious and political community." As I drove to the Millbrook police station, my mind raced. Chief Williams, now in his 60s but still sharp, met me with a grim expression. "Sarah, I was just a rookie when your daddy disappeared. Always felt like we didn't do right by your family. But this car, it's given us new hope." He led me to the evidence room where personal effects were cataloged in clear bags. My father's wallet, his reading glasses, his leather Bible with notes in the margins, and there, his gold wedding band, the one I remembered him spinning around his finger when he was deep in thought. The car was deliberately hidden, Chief Williams explained. Covered with branches, pushed deep into the forest where nobody would find it. Whoever did this wanted your father to disappear without a trace. But why? Dad was loved by everyone. He helped people, Chief Williams' expression darkened. "Sarah, there are things about this town, about the people your father trusted, that might shock you. Are you prepared for that?" I clutched the folder from the lawyer's office tighter. "I need to know the truth." "All of it." The next morning, I sat in the dining room of the Millbrook Inn, the only hotel in town, spreading my father's documents across the table like pieces of a puzzle. Bank statements showed large deposits into Grace Community Church's accounts, amounts that seemed impossible for a small-town congregation. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the church treasurer for over 40 years, was my first stop. I remembered her as a stern woman who counted every penny of the collection with hawk-like precision. Now 78, she lived in the same house on Maple Street where she'd always been. When she opened the door, recognition flickered across her weathered face. "Sarah? Lord have mercy, you look just like your mother. Come in, child." Her living room was exactly as I remembered. Doilies on every surface, family photos covering the mantelpiece, the scent of lavender and old wood. "Mrs. Hartwell, I need to ask you about the church finances in 1991. These bank statements show deposits that don't match the congregation size." Her face went pale. She set down her teacup with shaking hands. "Child, there are some stones that shouldn't be turned over. Your father, he was a good man. Too good for his own sake." "What do you mean?" She walked to the window, gazing out at the street as if checking for listeners. The church was struggling in 1990. Attendance was down. Offerings barely covered the mortgage. Then Marcus Webb showed up. Marcus Webb. I'd heard that name before but couldn't place it. He was connected, had money, influence. Said he wanted to help save the church. Started making large donations, brought in new members. Your father was so grateful. But those new members weren't from Millbrook. They came from the city, dressed nice, talked fancy. And they all seemed to know each other. Your father started asking questions when he noticed they only came to Sunday service, never prayer meetings or Bible study. Mrs. Hartwell returned to her chair, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The money they donated, it wasn't clean, Sarah. Your father figured it out. The church was being used to launder money." My blood ran cold. "Are you saying Dad discovered a money laundering operation?" "I'm saying your father was an honest man in a den of thieves, and honest men don't live long when they threaten million-dollar operations." As I left Mrs. Hartwell's house, I noticed a black SUV that seemed to be following me. When I turned left toward the church, it turned left. When I stopped at the red light, it stopped 3 cars behind me. At Grace Community Church, I met Pastor Timothy Wells, the man who'd replaced my father. He was younger than I expected, maybe mid-40s, with an easy smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sarah, what a blessing to finally meet you. Your father's legacy still inspires our congregation." The church looked different. Newer pews, fresh paint, expensive stained glass windows that definitely weren't there in 1991. "Pastor Wells, I'm trying to understand what happened to my father." Mrs. Hartwell mentioned someone named Marcus Webb. His smile faltered for just a moment. Marcus was a generous benefactor. He helped transform this church. Without his support, we might have lost the building entirely. "Is he still involved with the church?" "Oh no, Marcus moved away years ago. Business opportunities elsewhere, I believe." Something in his tone suggested that wasn't the whole truth. As we talked, I noticed how he kept glancing toward his office, as if he was anxious to end our conversation. "Pastor Wells, do you have any records from 1991? Financial documents, meeting minutes." I'm afraid most of those records were lost in a fire. Water damage from the sprinkler system, you understand. Such a tragedy. A convenient tragedy. Too convenient. That evening, I drove out to Millbrook Forest, following the directions Chief Williams had given me to the site where they'd found the car. The old logging road was barely passable, branches scraping against my rental car as I navigated deeper into the woods. When I reached the site, yellow police tape still marked the area. I could see where the black sedan had been hidden, surrounded by 30-year-old trees that had grown around it like a natural camouflage. As I stood there, trying to imagine my father's final moments, I heard something that made my blood freeze, footsteps crunching through the dead leaves behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, and saw a figure standing about 50 feet away, partially hidden in the shadows between the trees. Tall, wearing dark clothing, watching me. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing through the forest. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. We stood there in a tense standoff for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure melted back into the forest, leaving me alone with my racing heart and 1,000 questions. Someone was watching me. Someone who knew I was getting close to the truth. The next morning brought the first real threat. I found it slipped under my hotel room door, a simple white envelope with my name written in block letters. Inside, a single sheet of paper with a message that made my hands shake. "Your father couldn't leave well enough alone. Don't make his mistake. Leave Millbrook." Today, I immediately called Chief Williams, but he was out on another case. The desk sergeant, a young officer who looked barely out of the academy, took my statement with the disinterested air of someone filing routine paperwork. "Ma'am, it could be anyone. Might just be a prank. You sure you don't want to head back home? Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie." Even the police weren't taking this seriously. Or maybe someone was ensuring they didn't. I decided to visit the Millbrook Public Library, hoping to find old newspaper archives about my father's disappearance. The librarian, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, was more helpful than I expected. "I remember when Pastor Mitchell vanished," she said, pulling out boxes of archived newspapers. "It was the biggest story this town had seen in decades. But you know what was strange?" "What?" "After about 2 weeks, the coverage just stopped. No follow-up stories, no updates on the investigation. It was like someone flipped a switch." As I scrolled through microfiche of old newspapers, a pattern emerged. The first week after Dad's disappearance, there were front-page stories every day. Quotes from worried congregation members, appeals from my mother for information, statements from the police about active investigations. Then, suddenly, nothing. The story vanished from the papers as completely as my father had vanished from Millbrook. I found one small article buried on page 6 of the November 15th, 1991 edition, "Missing Pastor Case Closed. Family Requests Privacy." The article claimed my mother had asked police to suspend the investigation, stating that she believed her husband had left voluntarily. But I remembered my mother during those months after Dad disappeared. She never stopped believing he was coming home. She never would have asked police to stop looking. "Excuse me," I called to the librarian. "Do you know who owns the Millbrook Herald?" "Webb Industries owns it now," she replied. "Has for about 20 years. They own most of the businesses in town these days." Webb. There was that name again. That afternoon, I drove to the address I'd found for Webb Industries in the business directory. It was a modern office building on the outskirts of town, all glass and steel, completely out of place in rural Millbrook. The receptionist, a perfectly polished young woman, informed me that Mr. Webb was unavailable and had no appointments available for the rest of the week. "Could you tell him it's about Pastor David Mitchell from Grace Community Church?" Her smile never wavered, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. "I'll be sure to pass along your message." As I walked back to my car, I noticed the same black SUV from yesterday parked across the street. This time, I could see the driver, a man in sunglasses who made no attempt to hide the fact that he was watching me. I decided to confront this directly. I walked straight toward the SUV, but as soon as I stepped off the curb, the engine started and it pulled away, leaving me standing in the middle of the street feeling foolish and more frightened than ever. That evening, I called my mother in Florida. "Mom, I need to ask you about Dad's disappearance. Did you really ask the police to stop investigating?" There was a long pause. When she spoke, her voice was small, defeated. "Sarah, honey, why are you bringing this up now?" "Because I'm in Millbrook. Because they found Dad's car. Because I think he was murdered." I heard her sharp intake of breath. "You need to come home. Right now." "Mom, did you ask them to stop the investigation?" Another pause, then a whispered no. "I never asked them to stop. I begged them to keep looking until the day we left town." "Then why did the newspaper say, because someone was threatening us, Sarah?" "They said if we didn't stop asking questions, you might disappear too." "You were 6 years old. I couldn't risk losing you." The world tilted on its axis. "Someone threatened me? A man came to the house 3 weeks after your father vanished. Said he represented interested parties who wanted the pastor's family to understand that some mysteries were better left unsolved. He knew what school you attended, what playground you liked, what time I picked you up from Mrs. Davidson's after work." I sank into the hotel room chair, the phone trembling in my hand. "I packed us up and left the next day," Mom continued. "Changed our names, moved states. I've spent 30 years making sure we could never be found. And now you're there, stirring it all up again. Mom, they killed Dad. Don't you want justice? I want my daughter alive." Her voice broke. "Sarah, please. Come home. Let the dead rest." But I couldn't. Not when I was this close to the truth. The next morning, I found an unlikely ally. James Mitchell, no relation, despite the name, had been a young reporter for the Millbrook Herald in 1991. Now in his 60s and retired, he lived in a small house on the edge of town, surrounded by stacks of newspapers and filing cabinets full of stories that never made it to print. "I've been waiting 30 years for someone to ask the right questions," he said, pouring coffee in his cluttered kitchen. "I was the one who covered your father's disappearance. At least, I tried to." He led me to his home office, where he pulled out a thick file folder marked Mitchell, D. Killed Story. 3 days before your father vanished, he came to see me. Said he had evidence of a major money laundering operation running through several local churches, not just Grace Community. He had documents, bank records, photos of meetings between church leaders and known criminals. My heart raced. What happened to the evidence? That's what I've been trying to figure out for 3 decades. James spread photographs across his desk. "These are copies I made before someone broke into the Herald offices and stole the originals from our safe." The photos showed men in expensive suits meeting in what looked like the church basement. I recognized the stone walls and low ceiling of Grace Community's fellowship hall. But I didn't recognize any of the faces except one, a younger version of Pastor Timothy Wells, the man who'd replaced my father. "Wells was there in 1991? I asked. "He wasn't just there, Sarah. He was the one who brought Marcus Webb to your father in the first place. Wells was Webb's inside man from the beginning." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. The man who'd spoken so kindly about my father's legacy was the same man who'd helped orchestrate his murder. "There's more," James continued. "I did some digging into Webb Industries over the years. It's a shell company, part of a larger network that was under federal investigation in the early 1990s for money laundering and racketeering. But the investigation was dropped suddenly, and all the key witnesses either disappeared or died in apparent accidents. Including my father. Including your father." James pulled out a manila envelope from the bottom of his filing cabinet. "This came to my house 2 weeks ago, no return address. I think someone wants the truth to finally come out." Inside the envelope was a cassette tape labeled DM, October 28th, 1991, and a note. Pastor Mitchell recorded this 3 days before he disappeared. Someone should know what really happened. With shaking hands, I inserted the tape into James's old cassette player. After a moment of static, my father's voice filled the room, and I heard him speak for the first time in 30 years. "If you're listening to this, something has happened to me. I pray it hasn't, but I have to prepare for the worst. My name is David Mitchell, and I am the pastor of Grace Community Church in Millbrook. I have discovered that my church and several others in this area are being used to launder money for organized crime." Tears streamed down my face as I listened to his familiar voice, steady but weighted with sorrow. Marcus Webb approached me 6 months ago when our church was facing foreclosure. He seemed like an answer to prayer, a wealthy businessman who wanted to help save rural churches. But the money he brought, it was dirty. I didn't realize it at first, but the new congregation members he brought weren't believers. They were criminals using our services to clean their money through false donations and property purchases. The recording continued for nearly an hour, detailing names, dates, amounts, and methods. My father had been meticulous in documenting everything once he realized what was happening. I've tried to extricate the church from this situation quietly, but Webb has made it clear that I know too much to simply walk away. He's threatened my family. I've made copies of all the evidence and hidden them in several locations. If anything happens to me, I pray someone will find this and bring these people to justice. The tape ended with my father's voice breaking slightly. "Sarah, sweetheart, Daddy loves you so much. If you ever hear this, know that everything I did was to protect you and Mommy. Be strong, be brave, and trust in God's justice." James and I sat in silence for several minutes, both wiping away tears. "Where are the other copies of the evidence?" I finally asked. "That's what I've been trying to figure out. Your father mentions hiding documents in several locations, but he doesn't specify where on this recording." I thought about the documents from the lawyer's office. The trust fund paperwork mentioned safety deposit boxes. Maybe that's where. I was interrupted by the sound of vehicles pulling into James's driveway. We looked out the window to see 2 black SUVs and a police car. "Get the tape," James whispered urgently. "Go out the back door. Don't let them find you here." As I grabbed the cassette and slipped out through James's back door, I heard heavy knocking on the front door and authoritative voices demanding entry. I crept around the side of the house just in time to see Chief Williams himself standing on the porch, flanked by men in dark suits who definitely weren't local police. My father had been right. The corruption went all the way to the top. I drove straight to the bank mentioned in my father's trust documents, my mind racing with everything I'd learned. First National Bank of Millbrook was a small, traditional building that looked like it hadn't changed much since 1991. The bank manager, Mrs. Patricia Donovan, was a woman in her 60s who recognized my name immediately. "Sarah Mitchell, I remember you as a little girl. I'm so sorry about what happened to your father. He was a good man. Mrs. Donovan, I need to access my father's safety deposit box. I have the legal documents from his trust." Her expression grew concerned. "Oh dear, that box was accessed just this morning. I assumed it was at your request." My blood ran cold. "I haven't been here before today. Who accessed it?" "A man with proper legal authorization. He had power of attorney documents," and she paused, checking her records. "Oh my goodness." The documents were signed by Timothy Wells as the church's legal representative. But that shouldn't override your father's specific instructions. Mrs. Donovan, I think someone may have forged those documents. Can you tell me if anything was removed from the box? I'm afraid I can't discuss my father was murdered because of what was in that box. Please. Her professional demeanor cracked. There were documents, photographs, what looked like financial records. The man took everything. I felt like screaming in frustration. Every piece of evidence kept slipping away just as I got close to it. Mrs. Donovan, did my father have any other accounts here? Anything else in his name? She checked her computer. There is one more thing. A small checking account he opened separately from the church accounts. There's still a small balance and... She paused. There's a sealed envelope in our document storage that was supposed to be given to his next of kin only if something happened to him. 20 minutes later, I sat in my car in the bank parking lot, staring at an envelope marked for Sarah, if something happens to Daddy. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small key. My dearest Sarah, the letter began in my father's careful handwriting. If you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true. I have hidden the most important evidence in a place that only you and I know about, our special place where we used to have our father-daughter talks. I knew immediately where he meant. Behind the church, there was an old oak tree with a hollow at its base, where I used to hide treasures as a child. Dad would sit with me there on summer evenings, reading Bible stories and talking about everything and nothing. But getting to that tree meant going back to the church property, and after what I'd witnessed at James's house, I knew it would be dangerous. As if summoned by my thoughts, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a local number I didn't recognize. Hello, Miss Mitchell. The voice was electronically distorted. You need to stop digging or you'll end up like your father. Who is this? Someone who's been watching you make the same mistakes he did. You have until midnight to leave Millbrook. Don't test our patience. The line went dead. I had a choice to make. I could drive away, go back to my safe life in another state, and let my father's killers continue to prosper. Or I could finish what he started, knowing it might cost me everything. I chose to finish it. That evening, just after sunset, I parked several blocks away from Grace Community Church and walked through the cemetery that bordered the back of the property. The old oak tree was exactly where I remembered it, now much larger than it had been 30 years ago. I knelt by the hollow at its base and used my father's key to open a small metal box buried beneath decades of fallen leaves. Inside were documents that made my hands shake as I read them by flashlight. Bank records showing millions of dollars flowing through not just Grace Community Church, but 5 other churches in the county. Photographs of Marcus Webb meeting with known organized crime figures. Documented evidence of bribery involving local police, city council members, and even the mayor. And a list of people who had been silenced for asking too many questions. My father's name was at the bottom, with a date 3 days after he'd hidden this evidence. I wondered when you'd find that. I spun around, my heart nearly stopping. Pastor Timothy Wells stood behind me, no longer wearing his friendly mask. His face was hard, cold, nothing like the compassionate shepherd I'd met just days ago. 30 years I've been wondering where your father hid the real evidence. I searched everywhere. You killed him. I didn't pull the trigger, but yes, I set it up. Your father was going to destroy everything we'd built. Do you have any idea how much good we've done with that money? New schools, better hospitals, jobs for people who had nothing. Your father was so focused on the letter of the law that he couldn't see the bigger picture. That money was stolen. People were hurt. Some people were hurt so that many more could be helped. That's called sacrifice, Sarah. Something your father never understood. I noticed movement in the shadows around us. Other figures were emerging from behind tombstones and trees. I was surrounded. You don't have to die tonight, Wells continued. Just give me those documents and disappear. Change your name again. Start over somewhere else. We'll even provide financial assistance. Like you provided assistance to my father? His expression hardened. Your father made his choice. He chose his moral purity over his family's safety. Don't make the same mistake. I thought about my mother's words, about the life she'd built for us in hiding, about the peace she'd found in letting the past stay buried. Then I thought about my father's voice on that recording, about his faith in God's justice, about all the other victims whose names were on that list. No, I said, clutching the documents to my chest. I won't be silent. Wells nodded to the men surrounding me. Then you've chosen the same path as your father. As they moved closer, I heard something that made my heart leap with hope. Sirens in the distance, getting louder by the second. The sirens belonged to FBI vehicles, not local police. Special Agent Maria Santos had been tracking Marcus Webb's money laundering network for 15 years, following a trail that led through dozens of small towns and hundreds of shell corporations. When James Mitchell had contacted her 3 days ago with copies of my father's recording, she'd finally had the break she needed. We've been building this case for years. Agent Santos explained as Wells and his associates were arrested in the church cemetery. But we needed someone with standing to access the evidence legally. When you came forward as Pastor Mitchell's daughter, it gave us the opening we'd been waiting for. James Mitchell emerged from the shadows where FBI agents had been using him as a wire-wearing informant. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you, Sarah. But we needed Wells to incriminate himself. We needed him to admit to your father's murder on record. The next few hours were a blur of statements, evidence processing, and revelations that shook Millbrook to its foundation. The money laundering network had involved not just churches, but City Hall, the police department, local businesses, and even the hospital. Chief Williams, it turned out, had been on Webb's payroll for 20 years. The young desk sergeant who dismissed my threatening note was his nephew, also compromised. The mayor, 3 city council members, and half the police force were arrested over the next week. But the most shocking revelation came when Agent Santos showed me a photograph found in Marcus Webb's safe. Do you recognize this man? It was a photo of my father, but he wasn't dead. He was older, grayer, but unmistakably alive, standing in front of what looked like a small church in a rural setting. This was taken 6 months ago, Agent Santos said quietly. Sarah, we don't think your father was murdered in 1991. We think he was forced to disappear. The room spun around me. He's alive. We're not certain, but the evidence suggests he may have been given a choice: disappear forever or watch his family be killed. The car in the forest was staged to make it look like he'd been murdered, but we found evidence that someone had been living in a remote cabin about 50 miles north of here. The cabin was abandoned recently, but the DNA evidence suggests it was your father. 2 days later, Agent Santos and I drove to a small town called Cedar Falls, about 3 hours north of Millbrook. The local pastor there was a man named Daniel Miller who matched my father's general description and had arrived in town about 32 years ago with no history prior to that date. The Cedar Falls Community Church was tiny, maybe 40 members, nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains. As we approached the modest building, I saw a man in his 70s working in the garden beside it. When he looked up and saw me, the watering can fell from his hands. Sarah, it was my father. 32 years melted away as I ran to him. He was older, his hair completely gray, his face lined with years of sorrow and worry, but his eyes were the same gentle eyes I remembered from childhood. Daddy? He held me as we both sobbed in that little church garden, 30 years of separation and grief pouring out of us. Later, sitting in his small house behind the church, he told me the whole story. They gave me a choice, he said, his voice heavy with decades of regret. Disappear forever, never contact you or your mother, or they would kill all of us. They showed me photos of you at school, of your mother at work. They knew where you went, what you did, who your friends were. So you chose to leave us. I chose to save you. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, but I couldn't risk your lives. I thought maybe someday, when you were grown, when you were safe, I might find a way to let you know I was alive. We thought you abandoned us. Mom thought you chose the church over your family. His face crumpled with pain. I've lived with that knowledge every day for 32 years. But I've also lived with the knowledge that you and your mother were alive and safe. In Cedar Falls, I've tried to make amends by serving God quietly, helping people who needed help, being the kind of pastor I should have been all along. The evidence you left, it's going to bring them all down. Marcus Webb, Timothy Wells, all of them. Good, he said firmly. It took 30 years, but God's justice finally prevailed. 6 months later, I stood in the rebuilt sanctuary of Grace Community Church in Millbrook, now under new leadership and dedicated to transparency and community service. The web industry's money had been seized by federal authorities and was being used to fund legitimate community improvement projects. Timothy Wells was sentenced to life in prison for conspiracy to commit murder and money laundering. Marcus Webb, extradited from a non-extradition country where he'd been living under an assumed name, received multiple life sentences. Chief Williams and the corrupt officials received varying sentences, and the entire law enforcement structure of Millbrook was rebuilt from the ground up. But the most important transformation was personal. My father had decided to return to Millbrook, not as a pastor, but as a witness to the power of truth and redemption. He and my mother, who had flown in from Florida the day after our reunion, were slowly rebuilding their relationship after 3 decades apart. 32 years, she said to him during their first conversation in my presence. 32 years I thought you chose your calling over your family. 32 years I thought I'd lost you both forever, he replied. But God is the God of restoration. If he can bring justice after all this time, he can heal our family too. The truth was difficult for both of them. Mom had to process 30 years of anger and abandonment that had been based on a lie. Dad had to live with the knowledge that his attempts to protect us had caused us different but equally profound pain. But they were committed to the work of healing, guided by a faith that had been tested by fire and found genuine. As for me, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I left my job in marketing and enrolled in seminary. The experience of seeking truth, of fighting for justice, of seeing corruption exposed and victims vindicated, had awakened something in me that I couldn't ignore. I want to be the kind of pastor my father was meant to be, I explained to Agent Santos when she asked about my career change. Someone who tells the truth even when it's dangerous, who stands with victims even when it's unpopular, who believes that God's justice is real and worth fighting for. The Grace Community Church congregation, rebuilt with new members committed to transparency and service, called me as their pastor 6 months after I graduated from seminary. It felt like coming full circle, but on my own terms, with my own calling. On my first Sunday, I preached about truth and redemption, about the way God can bring light out of darkness and justice out of corruption. My father sat in the front row, tears streaming down his face, finally able to see his daughter not as the 6-year-old he'd left behind, but as the woman of faith she'd become. After the service, as I stood greeting congregation members in the shadow of that old oak tree where I'd found the evidence that changed everything, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not the kind of ending that erases all pain, but the kind of redemption that transforms pain into purpose. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Santos, another small town, another missing pastor, another family looking for answers. Interested in consulting? I looked at my father, who was deep in conversation with new church members about plans for a community food bank. I looked at my mother, who was organizing volunteers for next week's clothing drive. I looked at the church that had been corrupted and was now being restored. Some people are called to preach. Some are called to teach. Some are called to heal. I was called to seek truth and fight for justice, to be a voice for the voiceless and a light in dark places. I texted back, "Send me the details," because 32 years had taught me that God's justice might be slow, but it's certain. And sometimes it needs people willing to risk everything to help it along.